Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Today, our topic is a very special one that we've been asked about by a number of my patients and a number of my colleagues, which is who do I follow on YouTube and why? So it's my great joy to talk about this. These people are incredibly valuable to me, and I would like to tell you a little bit. I want to tell you their names, I want to tell you what they do, and why I think they're very important. We will include in the description below these people and their links. So the first is Ivor Cummins. Ivor Cummins is a chemical engineer from Ireland who his channel, he's called The Fat Emperor, and his show is called The Fat Emperor. Ivor Cummins is an incredible critical thinker and a root cause analyst, and his job was to troubleshoot all kinds of problems in manufacturing and science-based manufacturing, and to lead people all over the world in engineers all over the world in solving problems that were based on science and data. So Ivor has really brought a lot of value to me and my patients by helping explain on YouTube how to think about pandemics and epidemics, how to think about heart disease, how to think about cholesterol and blood tests and blood values, and imaging to image your heart and understand your calcium score and understand what risk factors you have and how to use a low-carb diet and a ketogenic diet or other types of diets, and how to read blood tests and understand blood tests to help you get better. So I use that a lot for my patients, and if you want to follow Ivor Cummins, I do. I also want to note that none of these people pay me or give me any kind of kickbacks for these endorsements. These are just endorsements from my own heart and from my own admiration. So Paul Saladino is the next one. Paul Saladino is a medical doctor who wrote the Carnivore Code, and he's called the Carnivore MD. He is incredible at writing about and describing what the myths are about carnivore diets and plant foods and otherwise healthy plant foods and fibers. It's changed really incredibly so many patients, and I followed this concept before I knew who Dr. Saladino was for many years. I've been in practice for 25 years, and the method of doing this has been a big part of my life for a long time, with my patients, nudging them away from lectins and toward a more animal diet when we can. That's not to disrespect those who have a religious reason or a spiritual reason for veganism or vegetarianism. I still want to respect those people, and I want to help them, and in fact I do treat many of them and design diets for them that respect that. But I just have to say that if you want easy and if you want simple, this is one of the easiest diets to follow in the world. It's easier than ketogenic. It's incredibly simple and straightforward and rewarding, and it gives fast results. So Paul Saladino. The next one is really a channel that most of these people are on, and it's called Low Carb Down Under. Low Carb Down Under also has a sister group called Low Carb Denver, and that is a group of folks from Australia and New Zealand. They're medical doctors and chiropractors and other PhDs and specialists of every flavor and ilk. And they talk about the low carb science and low carb myths, and they debunk a bunch of stuff about, when industry and commercialism tries to tell us what we should and shouldn't do for the wrong reasons. It's not to say that there aren't controversies and disagreements. There certainly are, but these folks are very able and mature and able to talk about those issues, bring them up and talk about the issue instead of ad hominem attacks. And the cool thing is they actually come to conclusions. They meet together, and they have panel discussions, and they answer questions and compare their answers one to another, and they defer to each other when one is more of an expert in a particular subfield than another might be. Dr. Sam Bailey. Dr. Sam Bailey has been incredibly inspiring. She has been chased and chastised by her boards and by her government in New Zealand as a medical doctor for the things that she's said about science and about data processing, and I find that onerous and terrible, and I think that you should watch Sam Bailey and find out what she says. And I whether you agree with her or disagree with her, I want you to watch her, and I want you to understand what she says, because she challenges the most fundamental assumptions and assertions of the medical industrial complex in ways that chiropractors have done for over 100 years. We've always said this stuff. And so when Sam says it, I'm just like, rah, that's wonderful. Sam wrote a fantastic book with a team called Virus Mania. Many of the people I talk about here are authors who have written incredible books. Her book is amazing. If you haven't seen it, you've got to read it. You've got to understand the background and foundation of that. So if you want to know about viruses, if you want to know about nutrition, if you want to know about industrial shenanigans and commercial shenanigans and how viruses are blamed for things that are very often toxins and chemicals and exposures and failures of health policy and layering too many vaccines on top of each other for certain groups to handle, you end up with a problem. And that brings us to our next topic, and that's Dr. Paul Mason. Dr. Paul Mason is a medical doctor who's also down there, and he is a sports physician, medical doctor who describes and explains a bunch of topics from lectins to exercise physiology to cholesterol and ketogenic diets and low-carb diets and the chemistry of how to do that successfully, and debunks a lot of the work about lectins, supporting the stuff I talked about with Paul Saladino and Zoe Harcombe. The next person is Stephen Phinney and his research partner, Jeff Volek. Steve Phinney and Jeff Volek are probably the best experts in my world for ketogenic diets. Now, as a chiropractic neurologist, I frequently work with families of children and adults who have seizure disorders. And as you know, in medicine, the most accepted, most well-studied diet is the ketogenic diet. And there are certainly problems where people can go off the rails with ketogenic diets. In many ways, they can go wrong. Dr. Phinney and Volek, these guys have done research for decades, and they've put together a lot of helpful videos on YouTube that describe the myths and the pitfalls of ketogenic diets long-term and how to get around them and how to properly deal with them. Because there are people that have had legitimate problems with their thyroid. Even Dr. Saladino's talked about problems with ketogenic diets and others. The next person in our famous list here is Sten Ekberg. Sten Ekberg is a chiropractor and an Olympic athlete who has just a fantastic channel. He does a great job making things very simple and explaining dietary factors and lifestyle factors and exercise factors. He's able to explain metabolism to people in a way that is super helpful. And all of these people are so helpful to me because I don't have to do this. If I can just say, go watch Sten Ekberg, I don't have to do it. And you can go watch him and you can learn something in 20 minutes and you'll be in great shape. And that brings me to my next person, which is Ken Berry. Dr. Ken Berry is a medical doctor in the United States with a wonderful Southern drawl. He and his wife describe all kinds of really short videos that are useful for my patients that don't need some of the deepest scientific understanding. Although Ken will bring science to the table, he will, both of them will bring science to the table in articles and really important things. But the key to Ken Berry's work is it's short and sweet. He gets right to the point. He doesn't pull any punches. He tells you which industries and which agencies are the problem. He tells you how to fix them. And he even tells those agencies how to fix them. So if you want somebody who's going to tell off the agencies, Ken Berry's your man. Our next expert from YouTube is Dr. Georgia Eadie, EDE, MD. She is a psychiatrist. She is a medical doctor and a psychiatrist, and she studies the effects of ketogenic and low carb diets on depression and mental illness. And she spends a long time discussing and explaining all the issues and the literature. And so if you want to look at all the different forms of mental illness and mental diagnoses, from depression to ADHD to anxiety and all in between, Georgia Eadie is a fantastic resource for you. Another psychiatrist, a medical doctor who I've studied for years and who has affected my life profoundly is Dr. Peter Breggin. Breggin and Cohen wrote Your Drug May Be Your Problem many years ago, which was a book that looked at all the difficulties of withdrawing from psychoactive medications. And a lot of people and their doctors would be on a psychoactive or psychotropic medication, and they would be told to get off of it once in a while by their doctor, and they would just go cold turkey, or they'd go 50% off and then down to zero within a couple of weeks. And Dr. Breggin was one of the first to bring to the public that maybe there should be a taper coordinated by your pharmacist that involves a 10% reduction per week or longer of some of these antidepressants and SSRIs and other types of drugs that you could coordinate with your prescriber. Now, I'm a chiropractic neurologist. I don't have a license to prescribe, and I don't work in that world. So I work with other people, but I don't prescribe or take people on or off medications. But I am intimately involved in that world with my colleagues who are pharmacists and psychiatrists and surgeons and medical doctors. So please understand that Peter Breggin has written a tremendous amount about medical fraud and graft in the industry. He's talked about the toxic psychiatry. He's talked about abuse in the industry and the drug component of that. Also the diagnostic component of the failures of the DSM and the DSM-5 to diagnose people correctly and completely. You know, when you get 6 or 8 people in a room and they achieve consensus for everybody, there might be a little problem with that. So, I think that Peter Breggin brings a real powerful other side as a psychiatrist to the mental health story. And he's also recently begun to talk about nutrition. That wasn't always a part of his work, but recently he's discovered in his own life and his wife's life a discussion about nutrition and the effects on the brain. Our next YouTuber is Dr. Tim Knox. Dr. Tim Knox is a medical doctor professor who got in tremendous trouble for talking a little bit about low carb diets to a nursing mother and a mother with children, to talk about babies and what you should feed a baby, whether it's nursing or feeding a baby that eats solid food. And that issue really triggered a firestorm where his license was threatened, and he was really investigated for years and had to fight tremendously for something that was really just a challenge to the status quo of the medical industrial complex. And he stood up and he won and kicked butt, and he really inspired me. And in fact, he also wrote a book a long time ago. He's a big athlete, and he wrote about running and exercise and endurance exercise, and he used to endorse a high carb diet. And many years ago, he looked at his book and analyzed it and said, I retract all that, and I've switched from a high carb to a low carb approach. And he had the humility to make that admission after writing a book and advocating a high carb diet and discovering that maybe it wasn't the best idea. So I really admire Tim Knox for that, and you'll see him on Low Carb Down Under and on YouTube. Perhaps the most powerful lecturer is Robert Lustig. Robert Lustig is a medical doctor and a pediatric endocrinologist at UC San Francisco, and he has an extremely popular, multi-millions of views, over 15 million views of his lectures on sugar. And so Dr. Lustig doesn't get pinned down to what kind of diet you should have. His main focus seems to be get rid of the processed foods, get rid of the artificial foods, get rid of the foods that are not real. And so he's been able to look at children and behavior and metabolism and insulin resistance and obesity and disease and describe to us the science behind the cover-ups about the food industry and about processed food of all types. Because I don't care if it's meat or dairy or grain. If it's processed, it's bad. And I think that that's something that we have to realize and figure out, that you're going to pay a price. Now, if I'm traveling and I'm taking a camping trip, or if I'm a military soldier on an operation and I've got to have some packaged processed food for a particular trip, maybe it's important to do that. If I'm on a trip to the moon, or I'm an astronaut and I have to have special kinds of food without any kind of bacteria in it or something, that makes sense. But most of life isn't like that. So there are certain times when it makes sense to have processed food, but not for most of us and not for chronic disease. If you've got some chronic disease, there isn't a chronic disease that won't respond to getting rid of the processed bad foods of any type. Whether you're on a carnivore diet or whether you're on a vegan diet, you've got to get rid of the processed foods and the chemicals and the grinding and the milling and the processing that comes with those foods. Even if there isn't modern chemicals in them, just the milling and grinding and processing of foods and cooking and acidification of foods and oils is a real problem, and that's what Lustig's message is. And so you won't find him pinned down about whether it's keto or carnivore or this or that, although low carb is a theme. The next is a couple of cardiologists. We're looking at Dr. Nadir Ali MD. He is a cardiologist, and he describes all of the dangers of statins and all of the times that statins are required, which is very small, versus the misapplication of statin drugs. He describes the mechanisms of cholesterol and the mechanisms of heart disease and gets rid of a bunch of myths that we have about diet and food. That brings us to our next person, Nina Teikoltz. Nina Teikoltz is an investigative reporter who wrote a fantastic book where she described the incredible graft and corruption in the processed food industry, and talking about how we have captured agencies and we have captured science and captured data and captured studies where the industry has provided science and literature that is rather fake. And what it does is it endorses a particular kind of diet, which is our standard endorsed diet today by our government. And that is not really the healthy way to get better. So following the guidelines that are in our current prisons and in our current school systems and in our current WIC programs, or they're changed their name now, but the current food stamp programs and all the supported food programs that are paid for by the government, involve having, 6 servings of grain a day. And so she blows the doors off of that idea. And she used to be a vegetarian too. And she switched to having a much more animal-based diet because of this. Our next expert is Michael Eads, a medical doctor who has been around for a long time and wrote some of the first early low-carb diet books. And he has a fantastic lecture, many lectures, but one of the lectures that he talks about goes back to ancient Egypt and looks at the morphology of Egyptians and looks at the difference between Egyptians and people of the ethnicity of Egypt of that time, of ancient Egypt, that had, ripped muscles and fantastic physiologies versus those that had kind of a big gut and man boobs and all the different physiology changes that happen with high carb diets. And so he described that. He looked at their teeth, he looked at their digestion, he looked at their body shape, he even looked at the carvings and the art of the time to show the different shapes of bodies, to show that today isn't the only day that we have dad bods. The next expert is Asim Malhotra. Asim Malhotra is a cardiologist who talks about statins and the dangers of statins, the difficulties behind industry and the pharma industry, and how they have corrupted the science behind cholesterol metabolism. And he's a powerful lecturer and a powerful presenter. He gets to the point really fast, and he has tremendous scientific background. Our next expert is Marianne Demasi. Marianne Demasi is a PhD who studies statistics, and she has great lectures on her descent into the statin industry, looking at cholesterol and carbohydrates, and again, talking about the underbelly of the industry. Her lectures are compelling, and she has a great deal of expertise on the technical details of the different cholesterol pathways, and she also understands the politics and a lot of the media side of the presentation, as well as the science. Zoe Harcombe is our next expert. She is a public health expert who lectures with a wonderful British accent for us Americans. She has great lectures, I mentioned her a minute ago, about fiber. She talks about the dangers of fiber and the problems of fiber, even though our conventional wisdom is that plant fiber is always good, and it isn't. For some people it can be devastating, and for others it can be merely irritating. So she talks about low-carb diets and the dangers of fiber and lectins and when fiber can be a problem, and she talks about the politics and the money and finance that goes into that, again, with the food industry. I think Stephanie Sanef is one of my favorites. Stephanie Sanef has been on the scene for a long time. She's an engineer and scientist and PhD who wrote the book Toxic Legacy. She is one of the people behind voice processing, which is a little less related to her particular topic now. But right now she talks about the topic of glyphosate and other poisons that are in the food supply and how they end up in medical products, and they end up in our bodies through supplements and food and any products that have oils or lipids in them. And there are a number of new medicines and injections that have lipids in them that affect low-density lipoprotein and that affect cholesterol and that travel through our bodies because there are certain genetic fragments and mRNAs that are held together by these lipids, and these lipids may have glyphosate in them. And so she's talking about that, among other things, and I think Stephanie Sanef is just one of the most clear-thinking and clear-speaking experts, and she cites paper after paper. She's a powerhouse. The last person for this legacy of my favorite people on YouTube today, which is the early part of 2022, is Paul Thomas. Paul Thomas is a medical doctor on the West Coast of the United States who is a pediatrician who had a massive practice. And Paul Thomas wrote a book about vaccines trying to describe, he's not an anti-vaxxer and neither am I. He's a person who said that parents need to evaluate every vaccine and every vaccine schedule and customize them for their children. And the board told him that he couldn't do that. He couldn't do anything that was against the CDC guidelines. And he said, well, the CDC hasn't provided any studies to test if that's true or not. And then Paul went out and did the tests himself, and then they took his license away. And so Paul Thomas is a hero of mine. Paul, I hope to meet you someday. I follow you on Children's Health Defense, and you inspire me.